I think we now have an opportunity to send a very clear message that the world is united, that all of us are committed to making sure that we degrade and ultimately destroy not only ISIL, but also the kinds of extremist ideologies that would lead to so much bloodshed.
When working to defeat a common enemy, the most important thing one must have with allies is simple. You must have a tremendous amount of trust with the people you work with. Yet it's fair to say that thanks to events over decades in the Middle East, trust is something difficult and often even impossible to come by with various nations. America once again faces an evil on the other side of the world that will seep into our lives here at home. And in order to defeat, or at the very least weaken, ISIS, Khorasan, and their like, we must trust those countries that always have suspect goals. How long can we trust them? Welcome back to MidPoint. Former U.S. Congressman and former chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Pete Hoekstra. Pete, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thanks so much.
Hey, great. Good to be with you. Thank you.
Here we go, Pete, and that is really the line I think that people need to ask themselves. We're working with nations now in the Middle East, some countries that we've always had a question about what their real motives are. How can we trust them? How do we bring ourselves to trusting these nations? And not only that, don't we always have to still ask ourselves, knowing who we're dealing with, what their motives really are?
Well, I think those are exactly the questions, but those are the questions that we've been asking for the last decade as we've fought this threat from radical jihadists. For 30 years, we were aligned with Mubarak in Egypt. For almost a decade, we were aligned with Gaddafi in Libya to fight this threat from radical jihadists. And as much as this administration would not like to admit it, for almost a decade, we also were aligned with Assad to fight radical jihadists. And now we've, two of those folks we threw under the bus. The third is partially under the bus. And now we're coming back to the same question that we asked a decade ago, that we asked 3 decades ago. Who can we work with? The bottom line is, if we are going to win this threat, against this threat from radical jihadists, we are going to have to work with people that we have questions about. It all becomes one of trust but verify.
In your mind, first country that comes to mind that we're either dealing with now or are thinking about dealing with, let's take Iran out of the mix because that's an entirely different animal altogether. But those we're doing business with now and may have to work with in defeating ISIS, who is the one that you least trust?
I think the immediate one that comes to mind is Qatar. Qatar has had lots of issues supporting the Muslim Brotherhood and these types of issues. There are some, we've had a love-hate relationship with Saudi Arabia for years, but I think, especially in Saudi Arabia, they may actually change their behavior now, become better allies, because they're now recognizing that this threat of the Islamic Caliphate may develop into a direct threat to the monarchy in Saudi Arabia. Their motivation, keep the monarchy in place.
When we look at Saudi Arabia, though, isn't it fair to say that this is a country that has always been, in one way, shape, form, or another, playing both sides of the coin? They're really good at it. They've done it so well. They hide their intentions very well, and they'll smile at you, but at the same time, you still are not sure what's really going on under the table.
Great description, but times have now changed. This animal that they have been feeding, radical jihadism, is now turning around and may be ready to strike them. This is where you'll have to verify. Are they going to stop funding radical Wahhabi mosques around the world? If they continue the funding, they're not serious. If they stop the funding, then it's kind of like, okay, they get the message, they understand, they are moving into a position to be a better and a stronger and a more long-term ally to the United States. Those are the kinds of questions you have to ask. With Gaddafi, remember, he gave us his nuclear weapons program. He gave us his chemical weapons program. He paid reparations to the victims and the families of Pan Am 103. We put restrictions, or we put expectations on him before we actually engaged with him and reestablished diplomatic ties. We ought to put the same kind of expectations on our quote-unquote friends and allies in the Middle East.
Pete, I've been wanting to ask you this question for a while. I'm glad we have the chance now when it comes down to this discussion. Because if you look at a lot of the people that you mentioned, a lot of the leaders that you've mentioned in the countries, we have spent as a nation multiple trillions of dollars over the decades, either funding them in one way, shape, form, or another, giving them something, helping them with troops, whatever, financial aid. Yet we still always wind up on the back end here having to look at somebody that we're pushing and they turn against us. Why are we as a country, here it comes, why are we so stupid? And why can't we learn to pick our fights, and not only that, but our allies better? We make the same mistakes every time.
And I think especially in this case, Ed, the reason, and you've articulated perfectly, why don't we learn? We make the same mistakes. You know, we allied with Mubarak, we allied with Gaddafi and Assad. We get a new administration in place. Those three folks are gone or are on the way out, and we go through a whole new learning curve. I think one of the things that frustrates me the most about this whole new, and I'm now using the word, it is not a new threat. ISIS is not a new threat. The Islamic Caliphate is not a new threat. This threat has been with us for 30 years, and now we're articulating and saying it's a new threat. The threat is common. It is radical jihadism. The problem is it just has a slightly different face, but we don't learn the lessons that and so we have to learn them over and over and over again.
I hate to put it in a sports metaphor, but isn't it fair to say this is the same league? It's just different franchises operating in different cities?
Exactly, and that we've said that for years, that Al-Qaeda, its model was that it would franchise its ideology globally, Northern Africa, Asia, the Middle East. It's exactly how they worked. We know who they are, we know how they operate, but we refuse to acknowledge it, and we just wish it would go away. It is not going to go away. We need a long-term bipartisan strategy that is going to confront this threat and do it in a consistent way for the next 15 to 20 years.
All right, let's talk some money now here, because that always comes in anytime there's a war. I want you to listen. Here's Secretary of State John Kerry talking about immediate financial assistance for the opposition in Syria. He made these comments on Wednesday. Here we go.
Today, I'm happy to announce an additional $40 million in immediate assistance for the opposition, and this includes more than $15 million for communications equipment, vehicles, food, other essential items for the armed opposition, as well as more than $25 million to support the civilian opposition as it works to build the capacity of governing.
Pete, would it be more efficient if we did indeed what the Secretary talked about, spending that money in Syria, or simply putting it in a large pile somewhere, getting a little gasoline and lighting the fire?
We did this a couple of years ago. We funded extremists. We gave them weapons, training, and arms. It's called Libya. Some of those arms, many of those fighters found their way to Syria. They are now part of ISIS. They're part of the Islamic Caliphate. We don't know who these Syrian freedom fighters are. I'm sure there's some good people in there. But some of this money, some of this training, and some of this equipment ultimately will be used to kill Americans, to target our allies in the Middle East. You talk about to give them the capability to govern. What are they going to govern? This is part of the president's strategy. I just can't buy into. I'm glad that we've got the airstrikes. I'm glad we're doing other things, but the Free Syrian Army, I don't believe, is a consistent and reliable and trustworthy ally. They're at the bottom of my list as to people who we should be working with. There are better alternatives.
45 seconds. All right, wait, let's hit that then. 45 seconds. Who are the alternatives in your mind?
Well, I personally, I'm doing work for the Kurds, in all full disclosure, but the Kurds, they were the only ones that helped us in 2003 to overthrow Saddam Hussein. They share much of our ideology. They've been friends for 20 years. Go with the Kurds in Iraq, in Syria, and we'll have a fighting force. Give them the weapons so that they will be equipped similarly to what the Islamic Caliphate is.
Are we smart enough to do it, Pete?
We're sure slow in learning that lesson. We're dragging our feet and getting them the help they need.
And again, we're going to be in this for years. I think those statements have been made over and over again. This is not President Obama's war to win or lose. This is going to wind up on somebody else's doorstep, and maybe even 2 administrations down the road. That is scary. Pete, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Wonderful comments again,
Great.
my friend.
Thank
We'll
you.
talk to you soon. Thank you.
Yep.
Later on this hour, taking a bite out of Apple's reputation is easy when they can't keep your phone working. Have you tried to use your iPhone here in the last couple of days? Have you tried to bend your iPhone in the last couple of days? Don't worry, people around here have tried it. I don't think it's worked. Also, after the break, the reputation of Iran. It's the one country that I mentioned to Pete Hoekstra we were going to take out of the mix and wait because it's an entirely different animal. Their reputation follows them everywhere, and what they may do to destroy America's aims against ISIS, Khorasan, and any other group in the Middle East. You want to talk about a country that many say we should not trust? It's coming up right here on MidPoint, where we question everything.